Before we begin the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you watched it in the comments. Snow pushed across the narrow valley in thin waves, tapping against the wooden walls of Elias Ward's cabin. Inside, the fire burned low, giving the room a steady orange glow. Elias sat at the small table, sharpening a knife he used for cutting rope and hides. His movements were slow and practiced, shaped by years of working alone with no one to depend on. He looked older than his 30-something age. His face carried the lines of a man who had gone through more violence than he ever intended. He once worked as a ranch hand and part-time tracker, but after losing his younger brother in a range dispute that spiraled into bloodshed, he left the towns and the people who kept pulling him into trouble. For the past 3 years, he lived alone in this valley. His mission was simple: survive the winter, keep the small herd alive, and avoid anything that forced him back into the world he walked away from. Tonight was quiet until he heard a faint knock. 2 short taps, then silence. Elias froze, gripping the knife handle. No one came to his cabin unannounced. The nearest homestead was half a day's ride. Travelers avoided this part of the valley in winter. His mind ran through possibilities: lost rider, trap, or trouble arriving at his door. Another knock followed. He set the knife down and stood slowly, every sense alert. When he opened the door, the cold rushed in sharply. An Apache woman stood there with snow on her hair and shoulders. Her breathing was uneven, and her hands trembled despite her attempt to keep them still. She looked exhausted, as if she had been walking for hours in harsh weather. Her clothing was travel-worn and lightly torn at the sleeve. Her eyes scanned his face quickly, checking for danger before she spoke. "My fire went out," she said, her voice low and strained. "May I stay tonight?" Elias felt a jolt of conflict. A stranger at his door meant risk. A woman alone in winter meant she had likely faced something serious before reaching him. He noticed a controlled stillness in her posture. She was trained to hide fear, but not trained enough to keep him from noticing it. He stepped back slightly to see past her into the dark valley. No one seemed to be following her. No distant riders. No lanterns. "What happened to your fire?" he asked. "Wind took it," she answered, "and I could not get it back." She wasn't lying. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her lips carried the color of someone who had been in freezing air too long. Elias made his decision. She needed shelter, and he could not leave her outside. Still, he kept his guard up. "Come inside," he said. Ayanna stepped carefully across the doorway, relief hidden behind a tight breath. She didn't drop her guard either. She scanned the room the way someone evaluates whether a place is safe, measuring exits, corners, and distances. Elias recognized that because he used to do the same. He closed the door behind them and locked it. She flinched at the sound of the bolt sliding into place. The cabin was small. 1 table, 1 stove, 1 bed in the corner, a shelf with folded wool blankets and tools. Ayanna's eyes paused on the bed, and Elias felt the need to explain. "I have 1 bed," he said, keeping his tone steady. "You can take it. I'll stay near the fire." She shook her head. "I don't need the bed." They both knew they weren't talking about comfort. They were talking about trust. Ayanna moved closer to the stove, holding her hands near the fire. When the heat reached her fingers, she let out a quiet breath she had been holding for too long. Elias noticed small injuries: a faint bruise near her ribs, a scrape across her knuckles, and stiffness when she moved her left arm. He didn't ask questions yet. She didn't offer answers. He set a pot of water on the stove, aware of her watching him carefully. He could feel her calculating. Is this man safe? Will he try to control the situation? Will he ask me to leave once morning comes? Elias had his own thoughts pushing through him. Why is she alone? Who did she run from? Is trouble coming behind her? And if so, what will I have to do when it reaches this cabin? He didn't want conflict. He hadn't wanted it for years. But he also wasn't the kind of man who turned someone away when they were freezing and afraid. Ayanna pulled her travel bag closer to her side, holding it with a protective grip. Whatever she carried in it mattered. Elias noticed the tension in her shoulders each time the wind hit the cabin walls. She wasn't just cold. She was recovering from fear. He served her warm water and a piece of bread. She nodded once in appreciation. They ate in silence, the fire the only sound in the room. After a while, Elias asked quietly, "You came far?" "Yes." "Trouble behind you?" She hesitated. Her eyes lowered as she measured how much to say. "Maybe." Elias didn't press. Ayana seemed relieved he didn't force the subject. The night settled deeper. Ayana moved her blanket to the floor near the wall, placing herself at a distance that kept Elias within sight but not too close. The calm light from the fire revealed the exhaustion in her face. She was trying to stay alert, but her body was shutting down from cold and fatigue. Elias looked at her once more before resting near the stove. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring: questions, danger, or simply another quiet day in the valley. But he knew one thing clearly: letting her in was the right decision. Ayana closed her eyes slowly, listening for any shift in the room. For the first time in a long while, two people slept under the same roof in Elias Ward's cabin, neither fully trusting, but both choosing the fragile safety of this temporary peace. The wind softened by morning, leaving the valley covered in a thin layer of frozen dust that clung to the cabin windows. Inside, the fire had burned down to quiet embers. Elias woke first. Years of living alone trained him to open his eyes before sunrise, listen for anything unusual, and judge whether the night had brought danger closer. He pushed himself up slowly, careful not to wake the woman resting against the far wall. Ayana slept sitting up, wrapped in her blanket, her arms crossed over her chest as if she were holding herself together. Even in sleep, her posture showed caution. Her breathing was steady but shallow, and her face carried the stiffness of someone who didn't allow herself to fully rest. Elias saw more clearly now the bruise under her ribs and the dark mark on her shoulder. They weren't fresh, but they were painful, and she had tried to hide them. He moved quietly, adding wood to the stove. The crackling woke her. Her eyes opened instantly, sharp and alert before softening when she recognized where she was. She took a slow breath and adjusted her blanket. "You should rest more," Elias said while lighting the fire stronger. His voice stayed calm, but he watched her closely. She moved her left arm with hesitation. Pain flickered across her expression, something she tried to conceal. "I'm fine," she replied, though the strain in her voice contradicted her words. "You're not," he answered, not harshly, but with certainty. "Let me look at that shoulder." Ayana considered refusing, but she understood the practical truth. She needed help. Her fingers loosened from the blanket, revealing the injury. Elias knelt beside her with a bowl of warm water and a piece of clean cloth. When he touched the wound gently, she tensed, not from fear of him, but from instinct to stay guarded. He cleaned the cut slowly, watching her reactions so she wouldn't pull away. The water exposed the depth of the bruise beneath. She winced, held her breath. "How long since this happened?" Elias asked. "2 days," she murmured. "Did someone do this?" Her eyes shifted away, not to avoid the answer, but to gather the strength to give one. "Yes." Elias pressed the cloth firmly enough to stop the bleeding, but not enough to hurt her more. He didn't ask who. She wasn't ready to explain that part yet. Instead, he focused on treating what he could see, cleaning the wound, wrapping her shoulder with a strip of cloth, and making sure she had support to move her arm without tearing it further. When he finished, she leaned back against the wall, breathing easier. She watched him with a quiet, analyzing expression, studying the way he handled things, methodical, steady, without unnecessary words. She spoke before he could stand. "I didn't come here to bring trouble to your home." Elias paused, unsure how honest to be. He didn't want trouble, but pretending danger couldn't reach him was pointless. "You're here now," he said. "You need time to heal. That's enough reason." Ayana lowered her gaze, understanding he meant it. He prepared simple food, boiled beans and leftover cornbread, while she regained some strength. She ate slowly, each bite showing how long she had gone without a proper meal. Elias sat across the room, letting her take the lead without pressing her. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable. It worked like a space where both could breathe. After finishing, Ayana finally spoke with more clarity. "There were men near my camp," she said. "They claimed authority over the valley. They demanded I return with them. I refused. Elias listened carefully. This explained the bruises, the fear, the urgency. He didn't interrupt. They followed me for a day. I tried to lose them. The storm helped, but my fire died, and I had no shelter left. Elias absorbed the information. He understood men like that. Push people until they break, use control as law. He had faced similar men in his past, the kind who tore his life apart. Hearing her explain, it stirred something steady and protective inside him. Not because she was weak, but because she had been forced to run without support. "You're safe here," he said, meaning every word, but knowing safety was fragile in the frontier. Ayanna watched him, try to understand his intentions. Trust didn't come easily to her, yet his consistency pushed her guard back a little. She studied the cabin again, seeing the structure clearly now. Its single door, its solid walls, the way Elias positioned everything with purpose. This was a place built for a quiet life, but also for defense. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders and shifted her weight, trying to sit straighter. The movement sent a sharp pain through her ribs. Elias noticed instantly. "Let me see that," he said. She hesitated for a moment, then lifted the edge of her clothing enough for him to examine the side of her torso. The bruise there was deep, spreading along her ribs. He pressed gently. She inhaled sharply. "Any breathing trouble?" he asked. "No." "Good. Then it's bruised, not broken," he said, relieved. "You'll need a few days. No heavy work." Ayanna nodded, though her eyes held frustration. She didn't like feeling dependent, and Elias sensed it. "You don't owe me anything," he added. "Just recover." Her expression softened, tension easing in her shoulders. It was the first moment she let out a natural breath. Outside, the valley brightened with pale winter light. Elias stood at the window, scanning the distant ridge for signs of movement. Tracks near the property caught his attention, faint but present. They looked like horse prints pressed into the snow before the wind hardened them. He didn't mention them yet. She needed strength before hearing more. Ayanna pulled her blanket close and watched him in silence. She understood the look on his face even without words. She knew he had seen something. Danger wasn't gone. It was only delayed. Still, for now, she had shelter. And Elias, though quiet and burdened by his own past, had already begun adjusting his life to make room for someone who needed protection more than questions. The morning continued with quiet tasks and careful movements, both of them aware that the fragile peace inside the cabin might not last, but neither was ready to break it. The morning light sharpened across the valley as Elias stepped outside to check the property. Ayanna watched from the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her movements careful and limited by the pain in her ribs and shoulder. Elias walked several yards away from the cabin, crouching where the snow thinned. The prints he saw earlier were still there, horse tracks pressed into the half-frozen ground. They were old enough to be from yesterday, but recent enough to confirm that riders had passed close. He followed the line of tracks only a short distance, stopping when he saw they curved toward the ridge and disappeared behind the low brush. He didn't need to go farther. He understood the direction they came from. He also understood that people didn't ride this close to his property unless they were searching for something. When he returned to the cabin, Ayanna studied his face closely. She didn't ask what he saw, but the tension in her shoulders showed she already guessed. "They didn't stop here," Elias said, shaking off the cold. "But they passed close." Ayanna lowered her eyes, absorbing the information without panic. The exhaustion from the past days had taught her to conserve her reactions, to think before letting fear take hold. "Will they return?" she asked. Elias took a moment before answering. "If they were following you, they might." Her breathing tightened. She didn't respond, but the shift in her expression revealed the weight she carried. It wasn't only fear of confrontation. It was the burden of bringing danger to someone who had offered her shelter. Inside the cabin, Elias added wood to the fire and set a pot of water to boil. Ayanna sat slowly near the stove, trying to keep her ribs steady. She observed Elias's hands, the way he moved with quiet certainty. There was discipline in him, something shaped by responsibility and past hardship. It made her feel safer, but it also made her wonder what had carved such distance into a man who clearly knew how to protect. As the water heated, Elias placed his coat near the door and checked the rifle leaning against the wall. Not as a threat to her, but as preparation for whatever might unfold. Ayanna noticed the gesture, recognizing the readiness of someone who had been forced into survival before. "You lived here alone for a long time," she said. "Long enough," he replied. She studied him, trying to understand the man behind the silence. "Is there anyone who would come looking for you?" "No." The answer was simple, direct, and carried a quiet ache. She didn't push for more. The wind outside picked up again, pressing cold air against the cabin walls. Elias returned to the table and began sorting tools, sharpening a small blade, checking rope, and testing the lantern wick. He wasn't preparing for an immediate fight. He was organizing in the way a man did when he wanted control over a situation that might change quickly. Ayanna watched him before, shifting her focus inward. Her injuries throbbed, reminding her why she had ended up here. She replayed the days before, the confrontation at her camp, the threats, the way she decided she wouldn't be controlled by anyone. She wasn't running from weakness. She was running because survival left no other choice. "You said they claimed authority," Elias said, breaking the quiet. "What do they want?" Ayanna straightened with a slow breath. She chose her words carefully. They wanted people to obey them. They said they were taking control of the valley. Anyone who refused would be corrected. Elias's jaw tightened. He had met men like that before. They weren't enforcing law, they were forcing submission. And if they were willing to hurt a woman traveling alone, they wouldn't hesitate to bring conflict anywhere they saw opportunity. "Did you know them?" he asked. "No," she answered. "But they knew of my tribe. They said I would be an example if I didn't follow." Her voice remained steady, but the memory hurt her. Elias could hear it. The fire flared stronger, filling the room with warmth. Elias handed her a cup of hot water. As she drank, he examined her posture. She seemed stronger than she had last night, but the fatigue still weighed heavily on her. "You'll need to stay inside today," he said. "Your ribs won't handle cold or strain." Ayanna nodded. She knew he was right. Still, she hated the feeling of being unable to defend herself. She clenched her jaw, frustrated at her condition. Elias moved around the room, checking the shutters and placing extra wood inside before the next stretch of cold arrived. She noticed the way he positioned items slightly differently, as if adjusting the cabin for someone else's presence. "Why do you live here?" she asked quietly. He didn't stop moving. "I wanted distance." "From what?" "From people who kept pulling me into fights I didn't choose." Ayanna understood that better than most. She felt a faint connection. Two people pushed into unwanted conflict, two people trying to keep their lives steady and simple, only to be dragged back into danger by forces that refused to leave them alone. A sudden gust rattled the window. Ayanna tensed, her instinct to reach for a weapon she didn't have. The reaction told Elias more about her life than any explanation could. "You don't have to watch the door every second," he said softly. "I'm used to it." "I know." Their eyes met briefly. Neither looked away. As the afternoon settled in, snow began falling again. Elias placed a second log into the stove and sat down across from her. Silence stretched between them, but now it carried less caution and more understanding. Ayanna adjusted her shoulder bandage, wincing as the cloth brushed her skin. Elias reached for a small jar of salve, placing it beside her. "It'll ease the pain," he said. She applied it quietly, surprised by the relief. Then she looked around the cabin, noticing details she hadn't observed last night. The way his tools were arranged, the worn edges of the table, the patched places where he repaired the roof himself. This was a place built by a man who expected no one to help him. "You don't have many visitors," she said. "None," he replied. "Yet you opened the door. You were freezing." Ayanna lowered her eyes briefly. Gratitude settled in her chest, not overwhelming but steady. Snow thickened outside, painting the valley white again. Elias glanced toward the tracks that lay beyond the ridge, faintly visible from the window. "They'll see the storm and wait," he said. "That buys us time." She absorbed the implication. When the weather cleared, things would change. But inside the cabin, for now, there was warmth, food, safety, and a slow-growing sense of trust that neither expected to find. They remained seated across from each other, listening to the crackling stove and the wind carrying snow against the door. Two people forced together by danger, beginning to understand that their survival might depend not on distance, but on cooperation. The snow eased near midday, leaving a heavy cold that settled deep into the valley. The sky turned a pale gray, and the wind slowed enough that the sounds outside became sharper and easier to distinguish. Elias stepped out again to check the ridge, while Ayana remained inside, resting her ribs and stretching her shoulder carefully under the bandage. She tried to move without wincing, but each breath reminded her that recovery would not come quickly. When Elias returned, he carried a bundle of firewood under one arm and a set of tracks in his mind he did not want to ignore. He removed his gloves, brushed off the snow, and closed the door firmly behind him. Ayana noticed the way he paused afterward, standing still as if sorting through what he had seen before bringing it into the room. They circled back, he said quietly. The tracks are sharper now. They were closer this morning. Ayana straightened, her body tightening in instinctive defense. She didn't panic, but her breathing grew slower, more measured. She understood the pattern. The men searching for her were not wandering. They were narrowing their focus. Elias set the firewood near the stove and knelt to feed the flames. The warmth spread through the cabin, but neither relaxed fully. She watched him, waiting for him to continue. He didn't try to soften the truth. They know someone passed through the valley, he said. Maybe they saw a sign while the storm broke. Maybe they're checking every place that could offer shelter. Ayana looked at the wall, jaw tightening. The idea of bringing danger to this place unsettled her more than facing it alone on the plains. I don't want them coming here because of me, she said. They already came near, Elias replied, whether you stayed here or not. He stood and fetched a lantern from the shelf. His movements were deliberate, showing he was preparing for the possibility that nightfall would bring more than cold. He checked the wick, tested the oil level, and placed it on the table. Ayana followed each step, learning the way he prepared for confrontation without raising tension. You could send me away, she said, though the thought hit her with a hollow feeling she didn't expect. It might draw them off. Elias shook his head. You'd last a day in your condition, maybe less. Ayana lowered her gaze, her pride pressing against the truth. She wasn't defenseless, but injury made her vulnerable. She didn't deny it. What will you do? She asked carefully. If they arrive here? Elias met her eyes, not with bravado, but with a quiet determination shaped by experience. I'll handle them if I need to. I don't start fights, but I don't walk from trouble that's already at my door. Ayana absorbed his words, recognizing a history in them that he had not spoken aloud. She sensed he had been forced into violence before, not by choice, but by circumstance. She wondered what he had lost that made him choose isolation over the company of others. Outside, the valley carried a stillness that didn't feel natural. It was the kind of silence that came when animals avoided open ground. Elias walked to the window and pushed the shutter slightly to look out. The line of the ridge stretched across a quiet horizon, empty for now, but far from calm. Ayana wrapped her blanket tighter. They won't give up, she said. Men like that want control. If they think I disobeyed, they'll keep coming. Elias nodded once. Then we'll be ready. He said it plainly, as if her presence had already become part of his responsibility. She watched him set aside his coat, tighten the belt on his revolver holster, and check the rifle again. He didn't rush. He checked each piece with the familiarity of someone who had relied on weapons only when necessity demanded it. Her eyes paused on the rifle, then on the quiet focus he carried. You've dealt with men like them before. I've dealt with worse, he answered, voice steady. And I'm still here. A small breath escaped her, part relief, part respect. She shifted carefully on the bench, trying to ease the strain on her ribs. If they find this place, they'll come with threats. Maybe violence. They won't listen to reason. Then they'll see I don't bend easily, Elias said. He spoke without arrogance. His tone matched the reality of a man who had been forced to fight for peace he never fully received. Ayana watched him with a mix of caution and trust. She didn't know his full past, but she didn't need every detail to recognize steadiness when she saw it. The wind grew softer, and the cabin settled around them. Ayana took a slow drink of water, then spoke in a quieter tone. There's something I didn't tell you. They weren't only after me because I refused them. They believe taking control of the valley will make others obey them. If someone like me stands against them, it weakens their hold. Elias listened without interrupting. Her explanation filled gaps he had sensed but hadn't asked about. It clarified why the men had tracked her so persistently. It explained their attitude, their aggression, and the bruise on her ribs. It also explained why they were unlikely to leave this valley without forcing a confrontation. They want power, she continued, and they want to use fear to get it. I wouldn't be quiet about what they were doing. They wanted to make an example of me. Elias tightened his grip on the rifle sling, absorbing her words. The situation wasn't a simple pursuit. It was a deliberate attempt to crush opposition. He understood the shape of this danger now, and it made his choices clearer. You stood your ground, he said. You paid for it, but you didn't bend. Ayana lifted her eyes. The recognition in his tone gave her a strength she had been holding on to only by sheer will. As night approached, Elias hung the lantern but didn't light it yet. Darkness would give them cover if anyone approached. Ayana sensed the shift in him. He was no longer only offering shelter. He was preparing for whatever followed. They ate a quiet meal, each thinking through the possibilities ahead. Ayana's breathing grew steadier, and her eyes softened with exhaustion. She couldn't fight anymore. Elias watched her struggle to stay awake and finally spoke. You should rest, he said. Your injuries need it. And you? She asked. I'll keep watch tonight. She hesitated, wanting to help but knowing she couldn't. Elias noticed the conflict in her face. You're not a burden, he said calmly. The words settled in her chest, easing a weight she'd been carrying since before she arrived. She lay back slowly, keeping pressure off her ribs, and let her eyes close. Elias sat near the door with the rifle resting across his lap. Outside, the valley darkened into a quiet, heavy silence. Ayana drifted towards sleep, knowing danger might be only hours away, but also knowing she was no longer alone in facing it. Elias kept his eyes on the ridge, listening for the faintest sound, steady and alert as the first stars broke through the winter sky. Night pressed against the cabin with a cold that felt heavier than the storm before it. Elias stayed awake near the door, listening to every shift of wind and every creak in the wood. The rifle rested across his lap, his hand near the stock but relaxed enough not to alarm the woman sleeping behind him. The fire was kept low for warmth, but not bright enough to announce the cabin's presence to anyone outside. Ayana slept unevenly, her breathing steady one moment and strained the next. Pain tugged at her body with each small movement. Near dawn, her breathing changed, shallow, quick, and uneven. Elias turned toward her just as she tried to sit up, gripping her ribs as she groaned under her breath. Her face was pale, and sweat had formed at her hairline despite the cold. He crossed the room quickly. Easy, he said, lowering to her side. What's wrong? Ayana tried to hide it, but she couldn't hold her composure. It hurts more than before, she whispered, voice tight. It burns. Her ribs were not the only issue. Heat radiated from her skin. The wound on her shoulder had darkened, and the fever had crept through her body during the night. Elias felt the temperature of her forehead and knew she had been fighting it longer than she admitted. You've got an infection, he said, keeping his tone calm so she wouldn't panic. You should have told me sooner. She pressed her teeth together. I thought it would pass. Elias didn't respond immediately. He understood why she kept quiet. Staying strong had been her only way to survive, but it meant the fever had progressed. He moved to the stove and boiled water, grinding dried herbs he kept for treating cuts and sickness. She watched him through half-open eyes, struggling to keep her breathing steady. Sweat ran down her temple, and she wiped it with trembling fingers. When Elias returned with the steaming cloth and salve, he knelt beside her again. She didn't resist this time as he unwrapped the bandage. The wound looked worse in the morning light, red, swollen, and seeping slightly. Ayana winced as the warm cloth pressed against it. Her body jerked once in pain, but she held herself still. You're going to feel pressure, Elias said, replacing the cloth with a clean one. His hands worked slowly, checking the wound for depth and signs of spread. Ayana clenched her jaw until the muscle in her cheek tightened. I don't want to slow you down, she said quietly, her voice shaking. You shouldn't have to deal with this. You're not slowing anything, Elias replied, not taking his eyes off the wound. You're hurt. That's all. Ayana looked at him, a vulnerable expression breaking through the guarded exterior she had held since arriving. She was used to managing injuries alone, used to survival without support. Accepting help felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but the fever had stripped away her ability to hide behind pride. Elias replaced the bandage and moved the lantern closer to give the area more warmth. She leaned against the wall, breathing through the pain. He noticed the subtle tremor in her hands. You need rest, he said. You'll feel worse before you feel better, but you'll get through it. Ayana nodded slightly, but looked troubled. If the men come back, and I'm like this, you'll be alone. I won't be alone, Elias said, his tone firm but not sharp. And they won't get inside. For the first time, her shoulders eased a fraction, not because she believed the danger was gone, but because she believed his certainty. He lifted the blanket around her and placed a wooden cup of warm herb water in her hands. She sipped slowly, making a small sound of discomfort as the heat hit her sore throat. He stayed beside her until her breathing steadied again. Hours passed with the fever rising and falling in waves. She drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes mumbling parts of memories she tried to push away. Elias stayed near the door, but turned to check her regularly. Each time he saw her shiver or heard her body tense with pain, a tightness pulled across his chest, an instinctive response he hadn't felt in years. Near midday, Ayana opened her eyes fully. Why are you still helping me? She asked, voice hoarse. You barely know me. Elias looked at her, collecting his thoughts before speaking. You came here hurt. You needed shelter. That's enough for me. Ayana studied him, searching his face for hidden motives. There were none. The simplicity of his response disarmed her more than any complicated explanation would have. I don't want you paying for my troubles, she said, her voice soft but tense. Elias leaned against the table, arms crossed. Your troubles showed up before you arrived. I'm not paying for anything. I'm choosing to deal with what's here. Her eyes softened with a mixture of relief and guilt. She hadn't been given choices like that in a long time. Her life had been shaped by survival, by distance, by people demanding obedience or silence. Trust had never been part of her world. Not until now. The fever surged again, forcing her eyes closed. Elias placed a damp cloth on her forehead and stayed steady beside her until her breathing leveled. He added more wood to the fire and adjusted the stove's vent to push heat across the room. The storm outside continued to hide the valley, keeping the riders away for now. As evening approached, Ayana's fever broke in a slow, painful wave. She exhaled deeply, her face relaxing for the first time since morning. Exhaustion weighed on her, but the worst of the infection had passed. Elias moved the chair closer so he could keep watch without leaving her side. She shifted, noticing the gesture. You don't have to stay there, she whispered. I know, he replied. I'm staying anyway. Ayana let her eyes close again, not out of weakness, but because her body needed it. For the first time since she fled her camp, she felt something close to safety, quiet, steady, uncomplicated. Elias remained seated beside her, rifle within reach, listening to the wind and watching the ridge from the narrow window. The danger hadn't disappeared. The men would return once the weather cleared. But for now, the cabin held warmth, and Ayana finally slept without fear tightening her jaw. And Elias, who had spent years shutting the world out, realized he was preparing to protect someone he had known for only a short time, but who no longer felt like a stranger. The fever settled slowly through the night, leaving Ayana drained but clearer-headed by morning. The air inside the cabin was warm, thick with the smell of burned wood and the faint scent of the herbal salve Elias had used on her shoulder. She stirred under the blanket, blinking at the dim light slipping through the shutter gaps. Her body felt heavy, but the sharp pressure in her ribs had eased, replaced by steady soreness she could tolerate. Elias, half-seated in the chair beside her, opened his eyes when he sensed movement. He had not slept much. The strain showed in the tightness around his eyes and the stiffness in his posture. Yet he straightened the moment she shifted, as if the long hours of watching over her had not tired him at all. "You're better," he said, relieved but cautious. The fever broke. Ayanna nodded slowly. "It feels that way." He poured water into a cup and handed it to her. She drank in small gulps, her throat still dry. Her hand steadied as she held the cup, and she noticed Elias watching for signs of weakness she no longer needed to hide. "How long was I out?" she asked. "Most of yesterday." "Through the night." He paused. "You talked a little. Things you didn't mean to say." She stiffened, worried about what slipped through. "What did I say?" "Nothing that matters," he replied quietly. "Just pain talking." His answer eased some of her embarrassment. She didn't want vulnerability to expose the things she worked hard to keep buried. But Elias's expression held no judgment, only a recognition that came from someone who had lived through his own battles. She shifted to sit upright, breathing carefully. Elias moved to help, but stopped himself when she steadied without needing support. She saw the hesitation and gave a small nod to show she appreciated the instinct. Outside, the morning air carried a sharp clarity. The storm had ended during the night, leaving the valley washed clean and still. That stillness meant visibility and danger. Elias walked to the window and opened the shutter just enough for a narrow view. Ayanna watched him from where she sat, noting the tension in his shoulders. The ridge was quiet. No riders, no smoke, no movement. But the clean snow revealed fresh tracks far in the distance, too faint to measure exactly, but visible enough to confirm what Elias already suspected. "They passed through again," he said. "Not close, but close enough." Ayanna exhaled a slow breath. She wasn't surprised. She felt the lingering weight of being hunted, a pressure that did not ease even when the valley seemed empty. "They'll come until they find what they want," she said. "They won't believe I vanished." Elias shut the window. "Let them believe whatever they want. You're staying alive. That's what matters." His tone was firm, not dismissive. She heard responsibility in it, something he hadn't asked for but accepted without complaint. She carefully pushed herself to her feet. Elias stepped closer instinctively but allowed her space when she steadied against the table. The movement strained her ribs, but she refused to stay in bed any longer. "I need to move," she said. "I can't lie still all day again." "Take it slow," he warned. "Your shoulder won't hold weight yet." She nodded. Elias watched her test her balance, her expression tightening with discomfort but not fear. He recognized strength when he saw it, her ability to endure pain without letting it break her. It reminded him of the people he once relied on before solitude became his only refuge. She glanced at the items around the cabin. Tools arranged neatly, ropes coiled on a hook, a saddle repaired with careful stitching. She realized the order in the cabin wasn't for appearance. It was how Elias maintained control over a world that had taken too much from him. "Why did you leave the towns?" she asked, her voice quiet but honest. Elias paused mid-step. He knew she deserved an answer, not out of obligation, but because she had already given pieces of herself without choosing to. "I had a brother," he said. "Younger. Good man. He got caught up in a dispute on a ranch. Folks pushed him into something he couldn't walk away from. I tried to pull him out of it, but things went the way they always seemed to go." He didn't describe the violence. He didn't need to. The tightness in his jaw filled the gaps. "I buried him," he continued, voice low. "After that, I didn't want anything to do with ranch hands, foremen, or the kind of men who believe fear is the only language people understand." Ayanna listened without interrupting. Her eyes softened, not with pity, but recognition. Loss were the same shape on everyone, even if the details differed. "You didn't run," she said. "You just chose a quieter fight." Elias looked at her for a moment, surprised by how accurately she read him. He didn't respond, but the silence between them shifted, less guarded, more grounded. Ayanna took a slow breath and steadied her hand on the table. "I can help with something. Sitting still makes me feel trapped." He considered her condition, then nodded. You can sort the dried herbs. That won't strain your ribs. The simple task gave her something to focus on besides pain or danger. She sat at the table and began separating leaves carefully. Elias stepped outside to split wood, glancing back often enough to confirm she wasn't struggling. Their routines began to align naturally. No planning, no discussion, just instinctive cooperation. Ayana folded blankets. Elias hauled water. Ayana organized the shelves. Elias checked the horse and secured the stable door. They spoke occasionally, but most of their communication happened through gestures, passing objects, moving aside for each other, sharing a quiet glance that said more than words could. Later, when Elias returned with water, Ayana looked at him with a question that had been growing since morning. "Do you want me to stay until they're gone?" she asked. He set the bucket down, meeting her eyes directly. "I want you to stay until you're safe." Her breath caught slightly, not from pain, but from the weight of being told she mattered in a place where she expected to be temporary. She wasn't used to someone else deciding that her safety was worth effort or risk. "Thank you," she said softly. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "Just heal." Evening arrived with a quiet calm. Ayana felt stronger, able to move without collapsing. Elias prepared a simple meal, and they ate by the fire with a steady comfort growing between them. Trust didn't form quickly for either of them, but survival had pushed them into a space where honesty came easier than distance. After dinner, Elias checked the rifle again. Ayana noticed his steady movements and asked, "Do you expect them tonight?" "No," he said, "but expecting trouble is how you stay alive." The fire cracked, casting long shadows across the cabin. Ayana leaned back, breathing easier. Elias watched her for a moment, noting the strength returning to her body, the clarity returning to her eyes. They were no longer strangers sharing a roof by necessity. They were two people adjusting their lives to make room for each other, quietly, naturally, without forcing it. And though danger still lingered on the edge of the valley, the cabin felt steadier than it had in years. Not because it was fortified, because neither of them was facing the coming days alone anymore. The next morning came with a pale, thin light that gave the valley a quiet, watchful atmosphere. Ayana moved more steadily now, though she still pressed a hand to her ribs whenever she shifted too quickly. Elias had stepped outside early to check the horse and scan the ridges again. When he returned, his expression told her enough. Something had changed. "They're close," he said simply. Ayana straightened, alert. "How many?" "3 riders. They stopped near the creek bed, maybe an hour out." He removed his gloves and set them on the table. They weren't moving fast. "They're looking for something." She glanced toward the door as if expecting a knock. Her heartbeat quickened, not from fear alone, but from frustration that her presence risked bringing trouble to this place. Her breathing settled after a moment, but the tension stayed in her shoulders. Elias pulled a chair closer, keeping his tone steady. "If they come here, I'll talk to them. You won't show yourself unless we need to." "They won't listen," she said. "They believe their word is law." "Then they'll see mine carries weight too." Ayana studied him. She saw no bravado, only a quiet readiness shaped by years of handling conflict without wanting it. She understood now why he lived alone. He had tried to escape violence, but violence had a way of following men who knew how to survive it. Elias moved through the cabin, checking shutters, testing the door bolt, placing the rifle near his reach. Ayana watched him prepare, noticing how he planned each detail. She felt a pull of guilt. "You didn't ask for this," she said. "I didn't ask to live through half the things I lived through," Elias answered calmly. "But I did. Now I choose what I protect." She lowered her gaze, absorbing the meaning behind his words. It wasn't sympathy that drove him, it was choice. And that made it heavier. Later, when the light grew stronger, Elias stepped outside again. Ayana followed to the edge of the doorway. The cold air stung her skin, but she needed to see what he saw. From the ridge, faint outlines flickered between the distant trees. Movement too controlled to be wildlife. "Riders. They're scouting," Ayana said quietly. "They learned my trail led this direction." Elias nodded. "They'll come here next." The two stood in silence, the cold wind tugging at their clothes. For a moment, Ayana wondered if leaving the cabin would draw the danger away, but she dismissed it quickly. Injured as she was, she wouldn't make it half a mile, and Elias had already made it clear that sending her away wasn't an option. Back inside, Ayana folded blankets, adjusting the cabin to appear as ordinary as possible should anyone enter. Elias observed her movements. She wasn't planning escape. She was preparing for confrontation in her own way, creating order in a situation where unpredictability threatened to overwhelm her. "You've lived through people chasing you before," he said. She paused. "Yes, but never for something this petty." "Power isn't petty to men who don't have real strength," Elias replied. "They use it to fill empty space." Ayana looked at him carefully. "And you?" "I don't fill anything," he said. "I stay quiet, so I don't have to handle more trouble than I already did." His words held a worn truth, one she felt echoed inside her own life. They were different, yet shaped by similar damage, forced into survival, pushed into silence, drawn into conflict they didn't want. As noon approached, Ayana heard something outside, a faint rhythmic crunch. Hooves on snow. She turned sharply, but Elias lifted a hand, signaling her to stay back and quiet. He moved to the window, opened the shutter a sliver, and studied the figures approaching the cabin. 3 riders, just as he saw earlier. They weren't rushing. They moved with the confidence of men who believed no one would challenge them. Their coats were heavy, dusted with frost. Each carried a rifle loosely in hand. Ayana's heartbeat rose. She stepped backward, shallow breaths tightening her ribs. Elias closed the shutter softly and positioned himself near the door. "They'll want to ask questions," he said. "That's all at first." "And after?" she asked. "That depends on what they think they're entitled to." Ayana leaned against the wall, steadying herself. She didn't want to face these men in her weakened state, but she also didn't want Elias to face them without knowing the full truth. "There's something I didn't say," she admitted. "One of them, the one in charge, said I'd be brought back and punished in front of others. They want to prove they can control the valley. If I'm here, they think they can break that defiance." Elias's jaw tightened. Then they won't find what they're after. The knock came, hard, uninvited, and carrying an air of ownership rather than request. Elias opened the door only halfway. The man in front, broad-shouldered, unshaven, looked him over with irritation at being greeted by silence instead of submission. The other 2 sat on their horses, hands on their rifles. "We're tracking someone," the man said. "Apache woman. Passed through this way. You see her?" Elias's expression didn't shift. "No one came through here." The man eyed him, unconvinced. "Tracks led to this valley." "Storm covered most tracks," Elias replied evenly. "You're reading ghosts." The leader narrowed his eyes. Behind him, one rider scanned the cabin windows suspiciously, as if expecting movement inside. "You alone out here?" the man asked. "Always," Elias answered. The exchange was simple, but tension stretched beneath each word. Ayana listened from the corner, her breathing shallow, her hands fists inside the blanket to keep them from shaking. The leader leaned slightly closer. "If we find out you're lying, we'll come back." Elias met the man's stare with unflinching steadiness. "Then you'll find out nothing." Silence held for a moment too long. Then the man jerked his reins and turned his horse. The riders left, but not peacefully. They left with suspicion. Their eyes lingered on the cabin long after their horses turned away. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Ayana released a breath she had been holding painfully tight. Elias shut the door, his jaw set in quiet frustration. "They didn't believe you," she said. "They don't need belief," Elias replied. "They need certainty." He looked toward the window. "They'll be back when they think they're ready." Ayana sat slowly, her ribs aching. Fear hadn't overtaken her, but anger simmered beneath it. Anger at being hunted, anger at dragging danger here, anger at the kind of men who built authority from cruelty. "We'll face it," Elias said, breaking the heavy silence. "You're not running anymore." She looked at him, the truth of his words settling deep inside her. "I don't want to run," she said. Elias nodded once. It was enough. The valley grew quiet again, but the tension between them had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve, shared without discussion, shaped by their mirrored pasts, strengthened by the knowledge that the next time those riders came, neither of them would face it alone. The riders' departure left the valley unervingly still. Elias stood at the door for several minutes after closing it, listening for any change in the wind or the faintest return of hoofbeats. Ayana remained seated, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket as she tried to calm her breathing. The danger had not passed. It had simply taken a few steps back. They'll return at night or early morning, Elias said finally. Men like that don't accept answers they don't like. Ayana eased herself to her feet, steady but tense. They believe fear is enough to get what they want. Then they're used to meeting the wrong kind of people, Elias replied, checking the rifle. Tonight, we'll be ready. She approached the table with careful steps, her ribs aching but her focus sharp. What do you expect them to do? They'll come on foot to avoid noise. They'll try to corner the cabin. They'll want to catch us inside. Elias looked at her directly. We won't give them that chance. Ayana